Welcome to One Dime Radio. I am here with Andrew from the channel Saint Andrewism. He is an anarchist, artist, and YouTuber who makes videos on a variety of topics, most notably anarchism, as well as on various topics like authoritarianism and one of my favorite things, solarpunk, which will be a big topic of this podcast. We will be talking about solarpunk, among other things like how this blends with anarchism and concepts like post-work. So anyhow, I'll leave it to you, Andrew, to introduce yourself, who exactly you are, what you do, and where people can find your work.
Hey, thanks for having me on here. I am Saint Andrew. I run the YouTube channel Saint Andrewism, as you pointed out. And other than YouTube, I write poetry, I write blog posts, I write fiction, I create digital art, and I just try to create and put out as much as possible. You can find my stuff on YouTube at Saint Andrewism, and you can follow me on Twitter at _Saint Drew. Honestly, I am bursting at the seams with things to talk about. I've always been a talker, always been someone with like a lot to say and a lot to share. And I've always been someone who's always like trying to learn as much as possible. So although I didn't originally set out to be like a YouTuber or anything, I just realized like I was blogging for a while before then, and I realized that blogging is kind of a dying medium, and videos is kind of where it's at. And plus I kind of wanted to blend my love for art with my exploration of various ideas. So that's kind of where St. Andrewism came from. And as for how I managed to put out so much, it's really drive and I would say like an unhealthy productivity sort of streak. And I guess decent time management. Plus, considering like where I am in my life right now, in terms of like, last year I was in my last year of college, and so now I'm about to graduate, and so I've had some time really to put into it, and so that's how I got where I am. And ultimately, there's just that push to just say what I have to say, to explore what I want to explore, and yeah, that's what drives me.
I would say I have a similar type of character, at least. I've really thought that YouTube is just a better way to influence people. You can just, way more people will just watch a video than they will read in an article. People just don't read anymore nowadays,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
I have articles. I usually have like at least a handful of articles in my like Chrome tabs to be read. So I totally get like people's inability to like keep up with all the posts and articles that are coming out, like compared to videos where you could put it on while you're washing dishes or on your commute and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and also it just holds people's attention better, right? There's sometimes
Yeah.
something to look at.
Speaking of holding attention, I greatly admire that video you did on acid communism. The
Thanks.
artistic production of that piece is top tier. It should go in the upper echelons of this side of YouTube.
Yeah, I really try to emphasize the whole visuals. Is like I started learning After Effects and I got really obsessed with it. Just I wanted to learn everything. And I
Right.
wanted to like make a aesthetic vibe for every video. So trying to like this video especially, I wanted to make this video and a meme warfare video. I tried to make like artistic experiments that are just really fun to look at and emphasize the feeling of what I'm trying to create, obviously, with the psychedelia vibe.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was fun to make. In general, that's a fun thing about YouTube, right? Is you can like express yourself way more artistically as opposed to just writing, because you can write like an article, right? And you can still put that out, but you can make a video essay with that just by recording
Yeah.
it and putting cool
Which
stuff.
is exactly how I started, right? My first one of my blog posts was getting particularly long. And so I realized people might not want to read it. So I decided to make it a video. And that's the education system is broken video that I had done last year, June or July, I think.
How did you, two questions here actually is Are there any creators that sort of inspired you to get started with doing YouTube videos? And the second one is, how did you get into this sort of politics in general? Like, let's say communist, socialist politics. I believe you identify as an anarchist politically. What got you into all of that? Or more broadly, the question sometimes people ask is, what got you radicalized?
Right. As for like who inspired me to start YouTube, there wasn't really anyone in particular. I once I got into the sort of quote unquote breadtube milieu, of course they were inspiring, but they didn't inspire me to start my own channel. That sort of just came of my own volition. But as for how I got into like politics, I mean, I had a bit of a journey coming out of like a sort of religious right background. But once I was out of that, I ended up getting into things like, well, first democratic socialism, and then beyond that, I dabbled in a few other ideologies, looked into a few other things, measured them up to see what was compatible with like my innermost like perspective, and I just ended up settling on anarchism because I realized that it was most compatible with my vision and personal expression and hope. Plus, as an artist who was really into solarpunk, it seemed very much compatible with those sort of aesthetic interests. Of course, my belief in it, for lack of a better term, goes beyond, of course, the aesthetics, but aesthetics helps, as we all know. So
Oh
yeah,
yeah, I emphasize that a lot. That's
yeah, yeah.
I
I'm preaching
think
to the choir here.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's maybe obvious to us, but for a lot of people, they don't see aesthetics as important. For them, it's kind of purely something that is like superfluous or secondary to the facts and the material conditions. And I can see that to an extent, but really, whether something is materially beneficial to someone, that might not be enough to really fully get them on board. They need to have some sort of imagination of what that future politics will even look like. And that's something that I find fascinating with Solarpunk. And that's a topic, the video that you did, which I first saw from your channel. It was the first video you did that I saw. It was what is Solarpunk? And I'd heard about it briefly. I heard about the literary genre and the art genre before, but only vaguely. And I knew steampunk was also a thing. But that video actually made me want to really look into this. And it was just really fascinating. And can you tell us a little bit about what that is, Solarpunk? Because I find it aesthetically and also in terms of what it represents as a future. I would call it a communist future, like post-capitalist future. Yeah, what is Solarpunk to you, and why do you think it's beneficial to the quote unquote left?
Yeah, I would say that like beyond it just being a future, I think solarpunk is a very much it's very much grounded in the present, right? That's what I tried to incorporate into my definitions because as much as I love to speculate about the future, well, love, sometimes I'm seriously scared of speculating about the future, but there also like there's an important emphasis that I think needs to be made on applying solarpunk to the present. So I see solarpunk as a vision of the of a positive future grounded in the existing world that emphasizes environmental sustainability, self-governance, and social justice. It's focused on human-centric and ecocentric ends, and of course, it aims to heal the relationship between humanity and nature, insofar as we are even separate from nature. Um, it focuses on what we can strive towards and build towards, more so than other genres, which focus more on what we should be trying to avoid. I also find it beneficial because it recognizes what I think more of the sort of the so-called left needs to recognize is that climate change isn't something that can just be averted. Centuries of damage can't just be undone in a couple decades. So I think it's as solarpunk as something that recognizes that people are going to have to be confronting this head on in this decade and the coming decades. And yet it still manages to incorporate hope. I find that to be very beneficial to our efforts, and very much applicable to what we do here now, on the small scale and also on the larger scale. And plus it's pretty to look at, so that helps too.
Yeah. I think there's a whole ideological element that the solarpunk art signifies, is that it's like you said, it's nature centric but human centric, and that's what I like about it, is because there is a trend on the environmentalist activist side of the left that I don't really like that's emerging, which is the degrowth movement, or at least how the sort of more liberal left use degrowth. And it's really this idea of sacrificing human advancement for the environment, and this idea of population control, and I think what are kind of dangerous ideas. Or I really see like degrowth without any kind of socialism would just lead to austerity, primarily for people who already suffer under austerity. So I call it green austerity.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say in response to that really is, I know there are a lot of like misunderstandings and misrepresentations and misinterpretations of degrowth floating around, even by so-called proponents of it. But if you don't mind, I would like to just pitch it.
Well, I'm aware that there's the anarchist degrowth, and then there's the sort of liberal degrowth that's put forth by a lot of NGOs. I know, I'm aware they're different. Like I know,
right.
I was about to get into that. Like there's Murray Bookchin's.
For the sake of the audience, I mean.
Yeah. Oh, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say what is essential for any sort of degrowth effort is, of course, the striving for the self-determination of people, and the dignity of people, the sustainability of an economy and a society, that can actually sustain life and the continuance of life. Of course, on the more like technical economic side of it, a reduction of the production consumption in the global north, and an end to that one-sided paradigm of development where some parts of the world are furthering themselves and advancing themselves off the backs of the other parts of the world. And of course, extending the democratic decision-making of people on the local level, and orienting towards self-sufficiency and local sufficiency and improvements in efficiency, rather than just cutting everything down just across the board. And of course, more efficient and more open and more connected local economies.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's inevitable that consumption and production will have to decrease, obviously. But the large part of the consumption, the overconsumption, is coming from the global north, and particularly not just everyone in the global north, but the upper middle classes and the wealthy classes are really who's accounting for the vast majority of overconsumption, and as well as certain, like a select few of corporations. I forget the study. I'm sure you're aware of it. Something like 100.
I think it's 100 companies responsible for 71% of global carbon emissions.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, exactly. So the point is the way degrowth is presented from a socialist, or if you want to say anarchist point of view, I see that as very different than the way, people like Bill Gates present degrowth, or a lot of liberals present degrowth as sort of a lifestyle that is broadly applicable to everyone. Whereas I think what I like about Solarpunk is that it shows a world where technology and environmental sustainability are compatible. It's sustainable growth, because I think we do need to develop the productive forces of technology that will be able to liberate people from a lot of drudgerous work that we traditionally had to do. And we'll need technology to create the abundance for a thriving post-capitalist society to ever function. So That's what I like about Solarpunk is that it does embrace technology and it does see a world where humans and nature can live compatibly in a way that is not Malthusian pro-population control or a sort of anarcho-primitivist view. That's another thing. There's a lot of, you could say, even people on the far left, but also even the right. There's like the Ted Kaczynski types, right, who react to
Yeah.
the environmental crises and they say, oh no, technology is just bad. You need to, they have really lofty solutions and resort to primitivist, quote unquote, lifestyleism to deal with this. Whereas Solarpunk is very much like a collective societal vision, which I really like. But this sort of brings us to another topic because in Solarpunk, I like the embrace of obviously technology, stuff like automation can be used positively. We can maybe take advantage of the forces of production rather than rejecting them entirely. Like automation is really scary thought under capitalism because people will be rendered superfluous. And imagine what would happen if the wealthy elite would be able to monopolize all the robots. It's a pretty scary thought, right? But it's a dream come true under any kind of socialist society. Another thing that is the idea of post work, something you actually tweet about a lot, and I do as well, is some people have a very big misunderstanding as what post work means. They think it means not working at all. They think they view it as either we have to work as much as we do now, or we don't do anything. What does post work mean for you, and is it something that the socialist left today is missing?
Yeah, so for me, post work is a sort of a move away from the notion that people need to be limited and controlled and directed for the vast majority of their lives to labor and toil for the production of commodities or for the production of services, whatever the case may be. It is against this pervasive Protestant work ethic that pushes people to basically enslave themselves to capital. And post work, I think, is something that really pushes us towards finding ways to reduce the role of work in our lives in both small and big ways, and as a broader social push in that direction.
That's why I really like David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs as a book because in the book one of the things he says is one of the best things we can do not only for just our emancipation as a species but for the planet is reducing work because of the sheer amount of electricity consumption and production for basically useless services like advertising. There's all kind of middle managers we don't need. And with think about all the superfluous jobs that are either in bureaucratic sectors, but also in things like advertising, that takes so much electricity just to keep those buildings on for so long, and all the computers that you're using, all of the resources. Post work is not only just good from a freedom point of view, it's just I think necessary really for the planet, and that's why I see it as kind of very compatible, well, very direct in line with a solarpunk vision of society.
Another thing,
But
another thing
go for it.
Solarpunk sort of emphasizes is the role of things like care work, which is often devalued in our society. But here's where I would pair it with post work. If we were to take, I think Graeber uses this as an example in one of his articles on Bullshit Jobs. If you were to take like all the private equity CEOs and lobbyists and PR researchers and telemarketers and lawyers and all that, and we just make them all vanish, nothing much would really happen to society, like negatively speaking. Whereas if you were to take away all the teachers and nurses and garbage collectors and mechanics, if they were all gone, obviously society would definitely break down because these are roles in society. Of course, not all those positions are care work, but these are positions in society that are necessary and yet are undervalued because although our society worships work and is like venerates the altar of work, some jobs that are actually important are not as valued as these pointless, bureaucratic, busy work stuff that you were just mentioning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's also, I see, is there's a lot of work that we do in society which is not considered work merely because it doesn't generate a direct profit, like house care work, obviously, just doing stuff like gardening or even taking care of kids. There's
Yeah,
all kind
childcare
of
and elderly care.
Yeah, there's all kind of labor that we do in society. And in that actually future video I referenced, I mentioned how, let's say we were to abolish work as a necessity. So not work as such, but rather basically you don't need to work to get access to a home. You don't need to work to get access to healthcare and education, to get access to a basic amount of food, stuff like that, right? Totally achievable things.
Yeah, I mean,
So
something that I want to cover extensively in the future is things like how gift economies function and and I suppose this is something that Graeber talks about in Debt, the sort of system of everyday communism that keeps society running, and how, in a lot of ways, work and all the systems related to work are obstacles to that sort of way of life.
mhm. Yes, absolutely. I mean, we're a society that will say, "Oh, doing social work, or I don't know, even writing literature, that's not real work. That's go to the real world and type on spreadsheets for 12 hours. That's like that no one's gonna read. That's
Such
real work."
important work.
Yeah, exactly. We cherish all kind of nonsense, and we see also there's this notion that some people who cannot really imagine a new future, they'll say automation won't reduce the amount of labor because it'll create new jobs. So we see actually not only is it not creating many jobs, like things like new industries that are emerging from the digital age, like Facebook and Snapchat, they employ under 1,000 people, but also the type of jobs that are generated are a lot of the time easily computerized, like data analysis, for instance, or computing. A lot of different sectors are very susceptible to automation. I talk about that in my next video. It was, I forget the field research study, but it basically went over all the a bunch of different estimates from economists on the amount of possible labor that could be automated, and it's approximately 42 no 47 to 82% of all. And it was just conducted in the US, mind you, so that's a bit limiting, but 47 to 82% of all US jobs are susceptible to automation within the next 2 decades. That's 20 years, and that's
Right.
huge, right? And
Yeah.
so but that might not happen, right? Because if
Yeah, because, for example, I look at things like the supplies of rare earth metals, right? Those things are not going to last forever. And the likelihood of things like asteroid mining, considering the state we're in right now, seems less and less likely, to me at least. Hopefully, I don't have to eat my words on that. But yeah, of course, those projections in terms of automation would definitely be concerning, because if you have all these reductions in jobs and there's no social system in place to support those people, obviously you're going to have issues. But then at the same time, something I see, I'm not saying that you necessarily do that, but I know there are people that do, which is something I also try to like warn against, is this generation of automation as like our ticket to freedom or whatever. Because as good as automation is, even if automation wasn't an option, we would still need post-work,
Yeah, I know what you mean. Because, well, we don't even need automation to give everyone basic necessities without work. Like, I mean, even Cuba, the USSR gave everyone free housing and education. That's easy to do. We can totally do that now without technology. But the thing is we can do that on a much better scale with technology. Obviously, we can decentrally planned economies without as much shortages due to the technology we have now. That's why I like projects like CyberSyn that the IND government tried to do, and which is more and more possible now. I recommend
I don't
books.
think I've heard of that project.
Yeah, it's actually the first attempt to really plan an economy in a decentralized way through like the cooperation of workers, like through their factories. So it was like
What'd you say it was called again?
Project Cybersyn, and it was under the Allende government, the democratically elected socialist government that was, obviously killed through a military coup backed by the
in
US.
Chile.
Yeah, in Chile, yeah. Very fascinating stuff. There's been a lot written about it. Actually, the YouTuber Plastic Pills, he has a documentary on it coming out soon.
I'll check it out.
Yeah, it's very interesting stuff.
But yeah, I also look at things like in terms of housing and that sort of thing. I look at the potential of, and this is probably me fresh off of reading this book, Walk Away by Cory Doctorow. It was sort of a post-work sort of society. One of the things he envisioned was like this sort of resurgence of the Wild West internet, where people were able to download and print like prefab construction like pieces and put together houses and spas and all sorts of things using whatever materials they had available to them, recycling whatever materials they had available to them. And so I see the potential of, if we were to loosen the stranglehold of corporations on the internet, I think we would see the proliferation of those sort of innovations using the technology we have. And that to me is also part of Solarpunk.
Yes, absolutely. Open access society.
Right.
Some people
open
call
access.
it the
open source.
Yeah, open source, or the collective commons. Some people call it that too. Obviously, the internet does show how there's a lot of things that can be provided at zero marginal cost. So essentially, give it for free. But there's even on a material level that there's potential for that too. Just not with everything. So innovations like 3D printing really fascinate me, because the potential of that is you can create things obviously at a zero marginal cost. So it doesn't cost more labor to create that same good. You essentially can, the even greater potential of 3D printing is the fact that people, if they are able to each own a 3D printer, they can create a lot of things for their own subsistence easily. Now, how beneficial this
or if
tool
a community,
will be,
of course, not necessarily every individual, but if a community were to have a couple of 3D printers.
Yeah, the super utopian vision, which would, I think, entail post-scarcity of resources, which is obviously unlikely at this moment. But let's say, space exploration, not conducted by Jeff Bezos.
Crashes.
Let's say it's like, I don't know, a democratically elected committee responsible to a community. Let's just say, okay, we did find
a space worker co-op or something.
However we want to envision it, But yeah, things could look even more different. But let's say on a realistic level, where you have to democratically plan a lot of the resources which the 3D printers need to create things, basically. And you can have different communities get access to a certain amount of 3D printers, which they use to maintain their subsistence. Things like that are really interesting, just because the whole question of markets becomes less necessary.
Yeah. And one thing I found particularly exciting with 3D printing is that I found out recently that you can 3D print with wood, whether it be like bamboo or like coconut or cork or ebony or all these different types of wood. And considering the sustainability of those compared to plastics or compared to metals, I think if a community were to say produce their materials that way, not necessarily everything, but the fact that is a possibility is exciting because it opens up a lot of avenues.
For sure, yeah. And the fact that they're 3D printing houses now in Germany, like as an experiment, and it's working, is fascinating, because the thing is, I'm not a techno utopian where I see all these like technologies, I call them labor saving technologies like 3D printing or robotics, for example. I don't see these as our ticket to freedom, because if capitalism will just use what it can to create artificial scarcity. So let's say material goods become able to be produced at a much cheaper rate due to 3D printing. They'll find other ways to monetize things through intellectual property. They might even have patents for the 3D printers, right? This is a dangerous possibility. So of course, like, I don't believe in inevitability. I think that if these technologies are just left to capitalists to monopolize, we're not going to achieve any sort of freedom. It's up to, I strongly believe in the notion that people make history, right, through changes. So it's up to however, this obviously would vary from nation to nation to community, but it matter whether it's, electorally or otherwise, there needs to be a power change. Simply, like there needs to be,
Hint, hint, wink, wink.
and that's what matters. This is where I try to show is like, no, the future might not be all that good. They could use, robots to control people even more. They could restrict access to all these things that could be the tools to our liberation. But the thing is, why I do see all of this as useful to emphasize is because there is a problem on the, it's two ends of the left, the social democratic union left and the kind of what I'll call the vulgar Marxist. Not all Marxists are like this. There's a lot of, but there's a certain type of the old, both are outdated models in my view, is the type who have this sort of workerism.
Yeah, the veneration of the proletariat.
Yeah, basically, they just want to establish, whether it's in the case of the Marxist-Leninists, a dictatorship of the proletariat, like a proletarian state, but they don't think about what, the end goal of Marxism was supposed to be is communism, right? High-phase communism. They don't really think about that. It's just this workerism, or in the union aspect is just worker empowerment through higher wages, or maybe at best worker co-ops, right?
Yeah.
So it's the thing about
people need to remember.
It doesn't think outside of production, right? It doesn't think outside of... Yeah,
exactly. And I would add that what people need to remember is that the aim of communism is the abolition of the proletariat, not just the empowerment, because what I think people forget is that the proletariat are defined by their relationship to the means of production, meaning they have to sell their labor to the capitalists in order to utilize means of production. But if the workers are in control of the means of production, they cease to be proletarian in nature,
Yeah, exactly.
So that's like more technical. I think people forget that though.
I mean, Marx says that directly in Capital Volume 2, and I believe also in Critique of the Gotha Program.
Let's be honest, how many people have read Capital?
Well, I mean, so-called vulgar Marxists should be, if they're gonna act like
there's this old acting, right? There's this old leftist comic that was something like, what did Marx think of this? And then the next panel was a guy reading Lenin.
Well, I'll give some credit. I don't really think that the bad ideas of Marxism come from Lenin. I think Lenin's often misread. Like, I don't really see Lenin as, there's a whole different story. Aside from the strategic element, like vanguardism, in terms of just the analysis and goals, I don't see Lenin as like a big departure from Marx. I see that more with the Comintern and Marxism-Leninism, which was synthesized under Stalin.
I mean, there's a distinction between Marxism-Leninism and Leninism. There were people who identified as Leninists but didn't identify as Marxist-Lenin.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's a big
C.L.R. James comes to mind, and of course he rejected like vanguard parties and that sort of thing. So his relationship to Leninism is a bit strange, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the main disagreement with the non-Marxist-Leninist people who like Lenin also is the disagreement with the whole socialism in one country, or as well as the nationalism, which I see as obviously a big problem with the way a lot of so-called socialist states turned out. But yeah, that's a whole other debate. But in general, I think I do see, socialism of all kinds is really a international movement. It requires international solidarity to work because you need trading partners of some kind. There's many reasons for this, obviously, just it's better, but you need trading partners because some areas have natural resources that others don't. They have something people
skills or talents. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just better, right? You're able to have less shortages. If you produce everything in one country, it's problematic.
And then on top of that, like, I think there are people who see that and they're like, there are people who would look at that and I suppose misunderstand what that sort of trade was like because of capitalist realism, so they would see they would hear you say that, oh, well, trade has always existed, and they'd be like, oh, okay, so like markets are like a natural inevitability. Whereas the kind of trade you're talking about is
it's not even
more
markets.
Along like what Graeber spoke about and what other anthropologists write about, what Marshall Sahlins called the original affluent society, where people would have shared their resources, where there were relationships. It was an economy of relationships rather than one of pure transaction.
Mhm.
If that
Yeah, I
makes
highly
sense.
recommend everyone listening to this to read or listen to the book Debt, the Last 5,000
It was
Years.
5,000 years.
Yeah, that's so it's such a good book. Really long, but the second chapter, that's what you need to know.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, this is a thing I see on, yeah, more broadly left. It's this workerism, but as you mentioned, capitalist realism. I think capitalist realism, uh, who obviously term coined by Mark Fisher, the inability to envision any future outside of capitalist logic. This is a problem on the left just as much as it is on the right. Maybe not just as much, but it is a problem. Do you know that you ever heard the joke that some MLs, Marxist Leninists, are the best social democrats?
Oh
It's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
yeah,
Insurrectionary social democrats.
yeah. I mean, I noticed this is the rhetoric I see online with some like Marxist Leninists is they'll praise certain socialist states for doing things that pretty much a social democratic state can do, like okay, raising the literacy rate,
Fed the
creating employment,
children.
yeah, or giving healthcare or building roads. That seems to be a thing now. Is, oh, if you build cool buildings, so
And then
socialism.
on the extreme side of that, oh, they went to space. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, and I think this is just really limits our logic because it just devolves once again into socialisms when the government does stuff, which is, you know, not what we should be striving for. I mean, not only just from a
It was supposed
truth.
to be a meme, guys, you know?
Yeah, it's supposed to be a meme. Like that's how the people who are brainwashed view socialism, and that we should be precisely moving away from that because there's this obviously equation with socialism slash communism and like big government repression. And yeah, like we obviously need to not only optically move away from that, but just ideologically, because that limits what the whole imagination of what's possible. And I really was surprised once I think you saw this. I got in a little debate with this Marxist once. I was talking about the idea of reducing work time drastically and
Right.
eliminating certain jobs that can be eliminated if possible, right? Which is just better for people's emancipation. And then you can have people have a greater freedom as to what they want to work on. It like in Marx's words, labor doesn't become a necessity, but life's prime want, right?
Right.
Um, and they just dismiss this as utopianism, as and that the real problem is just exploitation. Once you eliminate exploitation and people own their own work, quote unquote, own their own work, um, then that's fine. And I think this just misses the whole picture, don't you think? I mean, what's a more
Yeah.
persuasive pitch to people is more freedom, or just no longer being exploited.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think Bookchin had a quote that sort of points to what that person was suffering from. He said that, if I'm remembering correctly, the assumption that what currently exists must necessarily exist is the acid that corrodes all visionary thinking.
That's a good quote.
I think that's something that people need to remember. Even when you are a self-proclaimed radical, there are assumptions that you're still going to hold about like how the world is supposed to be. That when confronted with, you may be resistant, interrogating. So just try to be conscious of that. Speaking generally.
I think that ties very well also into hauntology, the inability to imagine new futures,
Right.
because
Yes.
that's a big thing that I see is, so there's this, I know, a little bit of a tendency among people who get newly radicalized. So they'll look at just history in general, they'll listen to some Michael Parenti lectures, and they'll realize that a lot of what's said about previously existing socialist regimes is not true or exaggerated. Right? These states did
Which
do
is
a lot of,
correct.
yeah, like they did a
Exactly.
lot of good things. Like I think, like if you look at the USSR before versus after, it's obviously an advancement, or Cuba, right? There's an example. It's good for what it was, but they're limited
Yeah.
to
I
the
mean, it
conditions
was
of
better
its
than
time.
Batista, and it
Yeah,
was better than the Tsarist regime. But
right. But it's
you're
also
not
like,
just looking for better than the capitalists.
yeah, pretty
You're trying to
exactly. It's
go
a pretty
beyond
low
that.
bar, right? And it's also not really Marxist to only look at that as just that's all what we can do, right? A Marxist looks at the material conditions and the contradictions of that society. And let's look at the USSR. It was a country that tried to establish the transition to communism in a place that Marx thought was completely impossible. Um, Engels and Marx both have said this in different times, but I can remember the Engels quote more particularly is that a country has to have a certain level of wealth and abundance and literacy for a transition to communism to be possible. And he named very specific countries: Germany, England, the United States. And he actually thought France was too underdeveloped, which is, just tells you, if you thought France was too underdeveloped for communism, then definitely not Russia. But that's the thing, right? Is you maybe can do a transition. It's just much harder. Russia could not give people a socialism that liberates people from work. It could give people like, universal housing, healthcare, literacy, good education, but it actually made people work more, and in many ways used a lot of coercion to amp up its productivity, as we know, with collectivization. But that's the thing, is we look at their condition. Okay, maybe one can justify some things that happened there with their economic conditions, but I see no reason why any socialist country should repeat this path right now, especially countries that are past the stage of capitalism, right? Russia didn't even make it past semi-feudalism, and that's why Lenin wanted 10 years of capitalism before a transition was possible. It's another complex story, but
Of course, to that end, I would point to, and I would recommend that listeners check out Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott, where he sort of speaks of the authoritarian high modernist project of the 20th century and how those efforts to sort of engineer society ended up going in the direction that it did. He has a whole section of a chapter dedicated to the USSR's project. So I just recommend folks check that out. Yeah.
Yeah, the USSR, obviously, while one might call it state capitalist, I don't even go that far, but it certainly wasn't able to escape capitalist production. It may have been able to have some sort of arguably socialist redistribution, certainly not production, right? It still had a very much top-down approach of, instead of bosses, you had bureaucrats. People did they really own their labor, But what I see is, okay, some people will excuse these things. They'll say it's because they were hampered by imperialism, low development. Yeah, but we don't have that excuse in a lot of countries now.
And then on top of that, right, if we were to acknowledge that these are factors, and they definitely are, then we have to find a way to work around them and to fight against them in ways that doesn't end in catastrophic failure, in ways that don't just go right back to regular neoliberal capitalism,
That's
or
right.
social democratic society. So even if we were to acknowledge, for example, that efforts like the Black Panther Party were sabotaged by the FBI with COINTELPRO, we also have to keep in mind that COINTELPRO was not the only factor. We have to keep in mind that there are criticisms of the party by former members of the party that we would need to take into account. And it's not just enough to look at those people. And that's what I see a lot of people doing. They look to the past and they idolize these figures, and they don't dig a bit deeper and look under the hood to see, where did they fail? What went wrong? How do we not replicate those mistakes? I think that is something that people need to look into. That is
100%
figuring out how to not replicate the exact same things that happened in the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that applies to a lot of ends of the left spectrum, more broadly. Like, it applies to the so-called democratic socialists, the ones who think that you can only electorally elect socialism in, like this long
Well,
democratic road to socialism. They don't really
I'm not
seem to
sure.
learn from the Allende projects, the projects in Bolivia, Venezuela, France, and Portugal, which just basically were co-opted by opportunism. There's many lessons to be learned on that. There's obviously the Marxist-Leninist failures that need to be learned from. Like, okay, maybe you need to reconsider democratic centralism as maybe preferable to liberal democracy in some respects, but it's not obviously. There's this idea. So you have disagreements. As some people think it went wrong with Stalin. Some people think it went wrong from the get-go, and then there's people, the Stalin defenders, who will say, "Oh, it's because of the revisionists that came after Stalin, like Khrushchev." I'm like, okay,
But then even if you were to
how would
accept that, how did they get in that position?
exactly,
How are they allowed
exactly?
to accrue that power?
That's the whole thing
That's a
too.
failure
Is
of your system itself. If it can't keep, or if it can't limit the power of bad actors, like if the only way for your system to work is for everyone to behave like angels, they have to rethink, right?
Mhm.
So even if you have like an abusive person, say, and anarchic society, there aren't formal avenues where that person can accrue power to dominate others. Of course, there are more insidious, more stealth like forms of social coercion and power. But that's part of the effort of ongoing social revolution, right? You're constantly looking to call out power and to lay those things to bear so that it's exposed, really. So it's in view. So people are armed emotionally and intellectually to resist those forms of domination.
Hmm. I think there's a kind of sick fantasy that a lot of people have that Stalin just didn't kill enough bureaucrats. I think, to an extent, Mao noticed a lot of the bureaucratization of the USSR, and he tried the Cultural Revolution as a way to get rid of the so-called rightists in the party. But did that work either? Right? I mean, you got Deng Xiaoping come to power. So
Exactly.
we need to look like there's something clearly wrong here, obviously. So now, I obviously
Yeah,
these are my
maybe
critiques.
shooting a bunch of people isn't the most effective way to change things.
So now this is my criticisms of Marxism, Leninism, obviously also social democracy. Now I'm going to turn to anarchism a little bit because I think there's also areas that could be learned from. Because one of the biggest criticisms people give about anarchism is that the projects are short-lived. Like whether you have Catalonia, or
Yeah,
the
I
other
mean, we could,
criticism is that certain anarchist projects might exist today, like, or anarchic projects that aren't really anarchist, but like anarchic.
right.
Take Chiapas, Rojava. They kind of exist at the mercy of the military. Like, for example, in Rojava, the US military, or Chiapas, the Mexican president literally visits there as like and treats it like a tourist attraction. So these are the criticisms I hear people. How would you respond to these? And what can anarchists learn as to how to establish anarchism and maintain it more effectively?
Right. So I think I mean we could look to historical projects, but I try not to get too hung up on those beyond looking to see where we can learn from them. I don't see them as things to replicate. So if we look at like Catalonia, they definitely get the alliances that were made and some of the shots that were called led them in a catastrophic, I would say, direction. We can't forget, of course, that they were betrayed by Saddam's forces. But if we're looking at like Chiapas and Rojava, um, these are projects that are more broadly anarchic, of course, and they definitely are beacons of hope for many anarchists and anarchist adjacent people. We also have to remember that ultimately those efforts alone are not going to overthrow capitalism, right? They still exist as little pockets, little bubbles in a sea of capitalism and imperialism. And of course, they don't claim to have achieved complete liberation because that is an international project. So I think until the efforts of social transformation are more international in scope, I think those projects will naturally be limited. You see that they do reach out to people in other communities. Like, for example, I know these Baptistas have sent delegates to other parts of the world. I think they went somewhere recently, but I can't remember the name. So I know they do a lot of outreach work to sort of spread their ideas.
I think they went to
And
Spain recently, right?
right, Spain. So those are definitely worthwhile efforts. But I think it's tough to really say with any certainty like what the right path is, right? Um, all I can and the global situation is not one that any one person has any control over or any group of people has any control over. Um, but I really advocate for resilience because at the back of my mind constantly is climate change and climate collapse and what's
Mhm.
going to happen with that. So what I look to really in terms of those projects, how those projects can further succeed is building and spreading resilience, building regional solidarity, and extending those networks of solidarity. Really, because what we have right now is like seeds, but those seeds are not enough to grow a whole forest. It's a strange analogy, but it
Mhm.
isn't enough for one or two
Well,
places
I
to
think we
take these efforts
still,
on. But
I think we haven't planted enough seeds. That's something
exactly,
I emphasize in my content a lot. Is I think we're at a certain stage. I mean, obviously, countries around the world have face very different socioeconomic
conditions.
conditions, but
Yeah,
let's just take where I live in Canada, or take a country like the United States or the UK. I don't think revolution of any kind from any party or any anarchist, Marxist, Leninist, whatever is possible in the time being. So what you need is to plant the seeds. You need to actually build support. People need to support a post-capitalist vision.
right. That's
Mm-hmm.
why we speak of ongoing social revolutions, or we speak of prefiguration, because even if there was a group, a party, whatever the case may be, that had enough power to stage a coup or whatever, or to overthrow the government or the capitalists, whatever the case may be, even if that were the case, if there isn't a base of a network of care, of support, of resilience, of things like food production and that sort of thing, energy production, localized energy production, that sort of thing. It'll be very easy for the capitalist and statist forces to snuff out that project, to starve
Mm-hmm.
out that project. So while this idea of going guns blazing and storming the proverbial Bastille may be like flashy and exciting, the real work is sowing those seeds.
Yep. This would lead me into actually one last question related to this is you have a video about consensus and direct democracy. Do you believe that consensus, well, first of all, what is consensus and direct democracy? And do you think it's applicable everywhere as not only a end, because I think a lot of people would agree with it as an ends, but as a means in terms of organizing?
Well, to be cliche, I would say that you can't really separate means from ends. But to first explain what consensus is, in essence, consensus is a form of decision making wherein, as a whole, people come to a decision about the best course of action. So it isn't a form of voting, although it is sometimes called consensus democracy, but it is more of a process of discussion where different voices are heard, different concerns are listened to, and solutions are played with and built upon until a decision that everyone can at least live with emerges. And of course, there are different ways to adapt consensus. Not everything I just said is applicable to all forms of consensus,
Right.
but that's the general gist of it, right? Of course, you have types of consensus where people abstain from a decision, or where people decide to delegate certain consensus-based decisions in cases where not everyone is affected by that decision. So only those affected will make the decision. And of course, you wouldn't have consensus decision-making for literally every decision in society, right? So you wouldn't have like this big meeting anytime someone wanted to, I don't know, paint a wall, right? But there are, that is one method that is certainly advocated for very heavily, especially by anarchic adjacent and anarchist people. As for the viability of it, that was the other question.
Yeah.
Right.
Is it practical for organizing on a mass scale for everyone to vote on everything?
Right.
Because it's one thing to say once we get communism we can do that. There's actually a lot of Marxists who write a lot about very in favor of direct democracy, like Paul Cockshott, for instance. He thinks that it's actually even more possible with the decentralized technologies we have, which can make us communicate far faster. But as an organizing strategy, it can be quite different, obviously, because decisions need to be made much quicker. Often there's a lot of confusion. And let's take, obviously, Occupy was not an anarchist movement, but it employed tactics which, let's just say, could be called anarchic, like let's just say the direct democracy assemblies, where everyone had to vote on everything in terms of what demands would be. And basically, if people vetoed, you would have to restart the vote. And what this sort of led to is no demands actually being made, no concrete demands, and sort of embracing this idea of not having demands, a spontaneity, which I'm actually very critical of. I do think there needs to be some level of organization, even if it doesn't have to be a vanguard party, right? I think you can have representative democracy where people elect a certain amount of, what do you want to call them, leaders or representatives, who basically decide on demands and kind of negotiate or help lead. And this can look different from the society we build once achieving, right? I think we can separate organizing and the end goal, because this is something I'm just not convinced yet, is I think, although you actually admit this in your video, is that consensus is just more viable with local communities as opposed to a mass scale. Do you think it is a universal ideal in terms of its applicability?
Okay. I'm actually not quite sure how to respond, because you'd said a lot there. So is there anything in particular you want me to bear down on?
Well, okay. So do you think that consensus democracy is applicable in terms of organizing in all scenarios? Like, let's just say in protests, you know what I mean? Revolution, if you want to go that far.
I say it depends, right? I'm not like dogmatically attached to consensus democracy, so I wouldn't defend it with my life or anything. So of course, there may be situations where like voting is preferable, or delegation may be preferable, or something like liquid democracy may be preferable. And I could probably get into that afterwards. But I'd say like consensus is like an option in some cases, and it's also impractical in some cases with like larger groups, especially when you are dealing with situations where you have so many different unique viewpoints. It may be it may be a space where not every voice is heard, as some voices are louder than others. So I would say that like in some cases it can work, and in other cases it doesn't. But ultimately, that's up to the situation and the experimentation of that decision, the experimentation of that situation to determine. I would say that there should be some process of participation for all the people involved, because we don't want marginalization of minorities and that sort of thing. Um,
100%. Yeah. Even if it is
yeah,
representative, there should always be the option to hold those representatives accountable or recall them from power, right? That's something I strongly believe in.
right.
But
So there's a concept in anarchism, delegation, which is similar to representative democracy in a way, but also not exactly, because the delegate doesn't make decisions on behalf of a group. Rather, they communicate the decision of that group to the people. So that's when people talk about, how is anarchism, quote unquote, scaled. Um, it's more of a matter of local level decisions being made, followed by those decisions being communicated on a larger scale. Because when we talk about things like scaling, so you speak of like the ideal of direct democracy being difficult to exist beyond small communities, right?
yes,
Um,
it's
and
hard in
that
large
definitely
groups.
is a concern. Um, what I would respond to that with is that if an individual action, if a particular action occurs at a certain optimal scale, I think that the best way to scale it beyond that would be horizontal proliferation. So rather than breaking it down to uh, more indirect forms of democracy, you would rather have how do I communicate this? Like groups
Mm,
of or like come to their decisions and then communicate their decisions and then go back and forth as the case may be.
okay, yeah. Just
So
one last
so
question
I've,
because it ran came to my mind as you were explaining that is there's one criticism that people often give. It's related to the same criticism basically, but the meme anarchism is one long meeting, one endless meeting. Is that true? Does that have to be true? And is that a bad thing?
right. So that's definitely something that I hear people talk about a lot. There's concern that there's going to be endless meetings under anarchy. But well, first of all, I would say that part of voluntary association, which is a value that anarchists hold, is voluntary disassociation, right? So you're not going to be anarcho coerced by the anarcho police to be at every discussion, every meeting, and the general assembly that is discussed is not the default form of decision making. People make decisions every day. They make decisions among their friends or among their family. And of course, there are different power dynamics maybe in play in those instances. But we all know that like having meetings all the time is not sustainable or a logical means of operating society. And we don't expect every person to be involved in every sanitation decision, every food production decision, every logistics decision. Um, But what we've seen, like in historically consensus-based or directly democratic societies, is that that sort of endless meetings model is not one that people operate with. They may not have constant meetings, but they may have like discussions over meals, or they may have people who make a decision as a group and then they just send one person in that group to communicate their group's decision. If you might have like households who might just have one individual who attends the meetings, or they may cycle it as the case may be, or rather than a meeting, you may just have, for some decisions, basic voting. If everyone agrees that they would prefer to just vote for the decision and the dissenters can live with the decision, right? So there's not going to be any one standard model. Um, I expect a lot of flexibility and experimentation where that's concerned. So yeah.
Great. Andrew, it was great having you on. It was a fantastic conversation. Do you have any concluding thoughts or projects you want to plug?
Yeah. Obviously, I want to thank you for having me on. It was a really, really great discussion. We covered a lot, and I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as I did. Of course, you can find me on YouTube at Saint Andrewism and on Twitter at _Saint Drew. And I've got some pretty exciting upcoming projects related to anarchism, related to Solarpunk, and related to like organizing. So I'm looking forward to those releasing in the coming months.
Awesome. Yeah, so if you guys enjoyed, go check out Andrew's work, and you can go share this podcast around. If you really enjoy the content, the podcast, as well as my YouTube content, feel free to support me on Patreon. The link's in the description. If you guys enjoyed, have a great day. Peace out.
Peace.